The British-born killer who brought terror to the heart of London.
Which is being treated as a terrorist attack until the police know otherwise.
We should be very, very careful about who we let into this country.
An effort to stop our democracy in its tracks.
We need to make sure that our intelligence services have the ability to get into WhatsApp.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're covering this week. London, the attack at Westminster. We do the media aftermath. How can the Romanian news media cover the corruption story when media owners are doing jail time for being corrupt? How many Mexican journalists have to die before the killing stops? And Grounded, the electronics equipment ban, written in Washington and London, as well as the response issued online. Londoners have had more than a week now to digest the news. A man plowed his car into a crowd, killing 3 people, rammed the gates of Britain's parliament, then stabbed and killed a policeman before being shot dead himself. Initially, there was confusion over the facts, leading some journalists and Insta pundits astray. Then came the declaration, the verdict from the authorities on whether it was or was not an act of terrorism. Nothing in the attacker's personal history, drug abuse, domestic violence, criminal convictions, jail time, none of it seemed to override his identity as a Muslim. He was an adult convert. Some have opined that the wall-to-wall news coverage played into the hands of terrorists. Others rallied to signal that London, Parliament, and the British people would not be cowed by an attacker whose terrorist links were unproven. Nevertheless, politicians and some media outlets that back them have called for more powers to intrude, surveil, and further securitize the daily lives of Britons. And the story, as it plays out in the media, is a familiar one. And in some ways, it tells us more about the news outlets involved, their tendencies, allegiances, and shortcomings than it tells us about the attacker himself. Our starting point this week is London. Stories like this one are as varied as the datelines that produce them, whether the news is coming out of London, Paris, Nice, or Brussels. However, the coverage, what gets said or written, especially during the early hours, the breaking news phase, comes with a familiarity that is template-like, a pattern.
The terror at the gates of Parliament.
There's a sense that every time one of these incidences happen, we're going to follow a well-worn script.
We know nothing about him yet, don't know who it was, or the motivation, we can guess.
Terrorism and acts of crime related to terrorism are very nuanced and very individual, and it's very difficult to come up with generalizations.
So what we knew immediately after the attack happened was that the attacker was a person of colour and that they had attacked Westminster. That was all we really knew, but already a narrative formed around that.
Witnesses described seeing an Asian man in his 40s.
The assumption that the nature of the attack was terrorist, the assumptions about the identity and the religious beliefs of the attacker. The Metropolitan Police were announcing a press conference with faith leaders very, very quickly before they'd even said anything about the identity of the attacker, which certainly pushes assumptions in a particular direction.
There is an element of laziness, there is an element of, well, here's an opportunity to try and get out there first with a new story, and the new story doesn't have to be new at all.
An effort to stop our democracy in its tracks. A new awful page of history.
There was no risk that the story would be underplayed, as well as the usual editorial mishaps that come when the race to be first trumps the need to be right. Britain's Channel 4 wrongly identified the attacker as a known militant who, it later transpired, was in jail at the time. The correction, the climb down, was very British in that it was so understated.
So it may be that we're not as certain as we were about the identity of this attacker.
Then there were the political voices on the airwaves, such as Nigel Farage, ex-leader of the UK Independence Party, who has never seen an anti-immigration storyline he does not like.
We haven't dealt with the growth of extremism because we've been too afraid to be called racist.
He blamed slack border controls.
We should be very, very careful about who we let into this country.
Which made zero sense, since the perpetrator was not an immigrant. He was British, and like Farage, born in the UK.
There's a racialised idea of the migration debate. So because the attacker was a person of colour, there was an assumption that he must not be from Britain. And that itself suggests that there is actually an idea within the anti-immigration rhetoric that it is people of colour who are a threat to the nation, and specifically migrants of colour.
It reveals more about what we want the agenda to be. So depending on where you're coming from politically, that's the bit that you're going to focus on.
People, particularly converts, joining because Islam is a gang.
People will pick out the motivation that actually fits the agenda and the political point that they want to make, rather than looking at the causes and the person as a whole.
One of the most pointed critiques of the media coverage, both the amount and the tone, read like this: "It is not the act that spreads terror, it is the decision on prominence. To over-publicize such crimes is to be an accomplice after the act." And that came from a journalist, Guardian columnist Simon Jenkins, whose view was not universally shared.
I think the coverage that was given is warranted. I think it's not disproportionate. Obviously, the location of the attack itself has very significant symbolic value, and I think it's clearly a subject of massive public interest, and the media need to do thorough coverage of it.
I don't think it was proportionate. I think it was over the top, both in terms of tone and scale.
You have a choice of prominence, and the prominence given to them now, I think, is aiding and abetting terrorism.
He was right to say that. That's exactly what happens. But the other effect of that is that it also fuels the narrative of the far right.
Right-wing papers in the UK, like the Daily Mail and The Sun, did their part, echoing, without challenging, the tough security talk coming out of the government. The perpetrator was reportedly phone messaging via WhatsApp just minutes before the attack. The minister responsible for domestic safety later said encrypted services like WhatsApp provide terrorists with a place to hide.
Can I put it to you that that situation is now completely unacceptable?
That is my view.
And that the security services need access to people's private messages. The Sun echoed that line too, even though there is not a shred of evidence the attacker had conspired with anyone, let alone over WhatsApp.
So it doesn't help. It's a self-defeating structure. But as a quick soundbite,
we need to make sure that our intelligence services have the ability to get into situations like encrypted WhatsApp.
It does sound nice, doesn't it, to say that we're going to take this seriously and we're going to take on these tech giants and we want to see the messages that these terrorists send, even if the reality of what you're saying cannot be achieved.
When the Home Secretary blames WhatsApp, and then the Sun newspaper joins in, and then the Daily Mail starts saying, well, it's Google, it's all the fault of Google. These are very simplistic explanations for things that are not simple. But the responsibility of politicians and the media now is to say, you need to engage with complexity. And instead of doing that, they're pandering and feeding this kind of simplistic narrative, which is not going to get us anywhere.
What it does get us is a series of scary headlines that work for security forces and the governments they report to. And it gets news outlets the ratings and clicks they need to survive. That's what happens when the media take a story and fit it into an existing narrative, instead of the other way around, crafting the narrative to fit the story, otherwise known as journalism. On the download now, our viewers on the coverage of the attack at the British Parliament.
By reporting that the attacker is British-born, the media outlets are refraining from using loaded expressions and are hinting that the attacker is originally from a different region. These personal descriptions are what aids the media outlets in deciding the amount of coverage that the attack gets. This is proven by a report published by Washington Post that conveys that news media provide disproportionate and extensive coverage to attacks by Muslims in general and foreign-born Muslims in particular.
We know that social media very much serves as an echo chamber for people's views. So when tweets were going up that were quite extreme in their nature, like we need to ban all Muslims from the UK on the back of this attack, it seemed as though far more people were agreeing with that than disagreeing. And of course that's not because the majority of people agree with those sentiments, but because of the lopsided nature of communication over social media. Frequent repetition and continuous and prolonged nature of the mainstream media coverage of that event very much fed into that frenzy of activity on social media.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week: governments in Moscow and in Minsk seem to be on the same page when dealing with political demonstrations in the two cities and contending with the journalists covering them. Police in Belarus arrested more than 90 journalists over the course of 3 days during protests there against new legislation called the social parasite tax, which forces anyone working fewer than 183 days per year to pay an extra $250 to the government. Some of the journalists arrested were released within hours. Others are awaiting trial. At least 5 have been sentenced to 10 to 15 days in jail. The charges include participating in unsanctioned mass events, disobeying police demands, and violating the procedure of production of mass media products. In Russia, meanwhile, the authorities made it equally difficult to cover the largest protests there in 5 years against alleged corruption in the Putin government and called for by opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who ended up in prison himself. At least 11 journalists were arrested, among them Alexander Plushchev of Moscow radio station Echo Moskvy and Alec Lun of The Guardian. All those arrested have since been released. It's not yet clear if they'll be prosecuted or if the authorities in Moscow were just out to sideline them while the protesters were making news. At the risk of repeating ourselves, another journalist has been shot dead in Mexico, the third to be killed there in a month. Miroslava Brek, a reporter for a national newspaper called La Jornada, was gunned down in her car in the northern state of Chihuahua, March 23rd. She covered organized crime, drug trafficking, and corruption. The gunman left a note at the scene which read, "For being a loudmouth." On March 19th, Ricardo Monliu, editorial director of the El Politico newspaper and a columnist for an online news outlet, El Sol de Cordoba, was murdered in the state of Veracruz, where he wrote extensively on local politics and the sugarcane industry. On March 2nd, Cecilio Pineda Birto, founder of a weekly publication called La Voz de Tierra Caliente, who also posted news on Facebook about crime and corruption, was shot dead in the southern state of Guerrero. Journalists then marched through the streets of Mexico City, protesting the country's culture of impunity for journalist murders and what they call collusion between criminal organizations and the authorities. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, 38 media workers have been killed in Mexico since 1992 for reasons directly related to their work. Another 50 have been killed in circumstances that were less clear. It's been 3 years now since the Thai military toppled the civilian government of Yingluck Shinawatra, and a TV channel aligned with the former government has now been taken off the air. On March 26th, the Thai Broadcasting Commission, the NBTC, announced that Voice TV would be suspended for 7 days for what it called biased reporting and repeated unfair coverage. The reports in question included a segment on the killing of an activist by a soldier in the province of Chiang Mai, as well as coverage of the government's seizure of an arms cache allegedly owned by a fugitive aligned with the former Shinawatra government. Voice TV has gone dark before. The channel was suspended for a month immediately after the coup, and some of its news programs have been temporarily forced off the air since, most recently last month. As 2016 drew to a close, Romanians elected a new government. 1 month later, that government came under serious pressure after it issued an emergency decree about corruption. It was not a crackdown. It was the opposite. The government wanted to ease up on the fight against graft. What followed was the largest series of demonstrations the country has seen since 1989 and the fall of the communist government of Nicolae Ceausescu. The Romanian news media have been accused of taking sides on this story. Outlets considered close to the government and the ruling Social Democratic Party were targeted by protesters who call them part of the corruption problem. Many of those news outlets have a conflict of interest, since their owners have either been jailed by or are being investigated by something called the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, known by its Romanian acronym, the DNA. Founded in 2003, the agency has gained ground in the anti-corruption fight, as well as international praise for its work prosecuting high-level politicians and business owners. And that's a story that many media outlets, given who's bankrolling them, are not at liberty to cover properly. The Listening Post's Paolo Ganino now from Bucharest on Romania, the media there, and a tale of corruption that runs deep.
Dan Voiculescu, owner of Antena 3, Romania's most watched news channel, currently serving a 10-year sentence for money laundering. Sebastian Ghița, owner of Romania TV, Europol's second most wanted fugitive, accused of blackmail and buying influence. Maricel Pacuraru, owner of Realitatea TV, released on parole in January after 3 years in prison. Dan Andronik, owner of BBC newspaper, under investigation for using his publications to get illegal kickbacks. In spite of their legal problems, these men still control, directly or indirectly, some of the most influential media outlets in Romania. And in a country where corruption is the top news story, the media reporting on it seem to be caught in a number of conflicts of interest.
The phenomenon has become more and more visible during the last 5 to 10 years, when a lot of strong businessmen started buying the media. The first one was Voiculescu. He started his media businesses in the early 90s. But in the mid-2000s, other prominent businessmen, almost all of them already convicted for criminal demeanors in operating their businesses, also started buying media.
Corruption stretches across the entirety of Romanian society. It is impossible to have corruption only in politics or only in business and for every other segment to remain untainted. Part of the media is of course biased. They're not objective when they deal with important topics related to corruption because they always have something or someone they need to defend.
Romania has 5 24-hour news channels. The UK, with a population of 64 million, has 2, and France, with 66 million people, has 4. In Romania, there's one 24-hour news provider for every 4 million people, and yet another news channel is about to launch.
With the fall of communism in 1989 and the advent of the free market, Romanian politicians and business tycoons saw an opportunity in the private outlets to come to further their own agendas. The public broadcaster TVR went from having a monopoly to becoming insignificant, poorly managed over the years and unable to compete. It left the field open to private networks with shady ties to take over the market and ultimately the message.
If you look at the numbers, at the advertising, at the costs for having such a TV station, the Romanian advertising market can only support 2 news TV stations. Those moguls are using those TV stations not as a legitimate business. They are using them like a hammer in order to destroy their enemies and also to support their own agenda, basically.
Out of 5 or 6 TV stations, only 1 is owned by a person who hasn't made his political or economic affiliations public yet. Unfortunately, we have a broadcast regulator that is weak and is headed by someone who himself is being investigated by the law and never intervened when there was a legitimate cause for correction or sanction of an outlet that had broken the rules.
The market for TV news stations is very big, quite similar to the market for commercial TV stations. This is why those who want power in this country see TV as an important tool. And I'm not talking just about politicians. Even the judiciary, for instance, they are very attentive to the work of the media.
Corruption in the government, between politicians and businessmen, in the judiciary even, is a major issue in Romania, especially now, when memories of the recent protests are still fresh. For weeks, in cities across the country, demonstrators protested a decree that would effectively allow cases of corruption to go unpunished. TV outlets aligned with the government tried to discredit the protest movement, which then directed its anger at them.
The people took the streets because they wanted the anti-corruption fight to continue and because they wanted the government to let the justice do its job. But those TV stations said that the protesters are paid by Soros, a well-known businessman and philanthropist,
Organizarea a fost finanțată de Soros.
or being paid by the opposition parties or being just stupid.
Some of the protesters directed their anger towards journalists and cameramen from Antenna 3 and Romania TV. And those journalists took the blows, took the rage of the protesters, of the public, for what their news outlets did, which is blatant manipulation, disinformation about the meaning of those protests and the way those protests actually develop.
Ceea ce se întâmplă este socotit de unii ca fiind un protest legitim, este socotit de alții ca fiind o lovitură de stat în desfășurare.
Some of the journalists who did not side with the government during the protests were singled out by the Interior Minister. At a press conference, she read out the names of the reporters who she said instigated the protests. Another area of contention is the coverage of the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, the DNA. The DNA is the agency tasked with monitoring and prosecuting cases of graft. In a country where so many are suspicious of state-run bodies, it is an anomaly. Polls say 60% of Romanians trust the DNA. Just 30% have faith in their media outlets, some of which give the DNA a rough ride, especially organizations whose bosses the agency has investigated or sent to prison.
Deodată, în România,
all of a sudden, this institution, the DNA, entered our sphere of attention. Over the past decade, we have seen a parallel state which runs independent of democratic and constitutional norms. There is no presumption of innocence here. That is why many of my colleagues call the DNA the media production house. It provides the media with so many images of people in handcuffs, guilty or not guilty, who have had their political careers destroyed.
We've seen media campaign against judges from the highest court of Romania, from the Constitutional Court, and also against prosecutors. We've seen some pictures with a high-profile judge, with a young lady, and they were saying, look, he's cheating on his wife, he goes out with a teenage girl, and it turned out that it was his daughter.
The anti-corruption campaign has gained momentum probably in the last 3 to 4 years. And this is when media from both sides of the political life is attacking the justice or the prosecutors. And the other victim of this media abuse is not only the truth, but a legitimate public debate over the functioning of the justice. They are far from being perfect, and the politicians, the society, the journalists, the NGOs need to discuss those issues, but without personal interest, to discuss everything in the public interest.
And finally, last week, the UK and US governments announced an electronics ban limiting what kind of technology air passengers can use. However, the ban only applies to 9 airlines, all of them based in the Middle East. Stories like this one are what social media is made for. Feeds lit up with posts suggesting that the new measure really has nothing to do with security, but on certain routes does provide airlines from the US and Britain with a competitive advantage. We've collected some online feedback from the airlines affected, cartoons on the topic, and a few comments from frequent flyers who make some salient points on the new policy and deliver them in ways that you will not likely see in the mainstream news media. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.